Jan and Quiana Pietrzak were the kind of couple everyone admired. Two people who had built their love on loyalty, sacrifice, and hope. He was a proud Marine who had survived war zones. She was a spirited woman whose laughter could light up a room. But in one unimaginable night, their American dream turned into a nightmare when jealousy and hate invaded their home. What followed was a crime so brutal, so senseless, that it shocked even the most seasoned investigators. A love story destroyed by the very evil they never saw coming. Jan Pietrzak was the kind of man people admired instantly. Calm, respectful, and steady in his convictions, he carried himself with quiet confidence. Born to Polish immigrants, he understood discipline and hard work from an early age. His dream had always been to serve his country, and when he joined the Marines, it felt like his purpose had finally been fulfilled. He wasn't driven by glory or recognition, he believed in duty. It was there, amid the challenges of military life, that Jan grew into a man others could depend on. His fellow Marines saw him as someone who led not by shouting but by example. When he returned home from his tour overseas, he carried both pride and exhaustion, ready to begin a new chapter that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with love. Quiana Jenkins was everything Jan wasn't: vibrant, outgoing, and effortlessly warm. She had an energy that filled every room she entered. Raised in a close-knit family in New York, Quiana was the kind of person who believed in the best in everyone. She worked hard, laughed often, and made people feel seen. When she met Jan, she saw something in him that went beyond the uniform, a kindness that matched her own. Their love grew quickly, bound by deep respect and shared values. They were different in so many ways, yet somehow perfectly balanced. Where Jan was quiet, Quiana was expressive. Where he was measured, she was spontaneous. Together they were complete. After months of dating, they decided to marry. Their wedding was small but filled with joy, a gathering of friends and family who believed they were witnessing the start of something special. Jan stood tall in his Marine dress uniform, and Quiana, radiant in white, couldn't stop smiling. It was the kind of love people dream about, honest, strong, and pure. When they moved into their new home in Winchester, California, it wasn't much, but to them it was everything. They had finally found a place to call their own, a space where love would grow in peace after years of long distance and separation. Jan took pride in the life they were building. He worked hard, often long hours, to ensure that Quiana had everything she needed. He talked about starting a family, about how their future children would one day play in the backyard. Quiana in turn filled their home with warmth, candles, laughter, and music. The walls were adorned with photos of their travels, smiles frozen in time. Friends often visited and left saying the same thing: they were made for each other. But in every story of happiness, there sometimes lurks an unseen shadow. Among Jan's fellow Marines were men who didn't share his optimism or his values. Some had been discharged, others had grown bitter. They watched from the sidelines as Jan thrived, jealous of his stability and success. His marriage to Quiana, a beautiful black woman, stirred something even uglier in their hearts: resentment mixed with hate. In the military, where loyalty and brotherhood were sacred, these men twisted that bond into something poisoned. Jan didn't know that a few of those he once trusted spoke about him behind his back, mocking his happiness and planning ways to take what he had. They didn't see him as a fellow Marine anymore. They saw him as a target. To them, his house was filled with things they thought they deserved. His wife was someone they envied but disrespected. And while Jan and Quiana were building a home rooted in love, these men were sinking deeper into darkness, feeding on greed and hatred. As the California sun set over the desert horizon, Jan sat on his porch watching the light fade into the hills. He didn't know that people he once called brothers were already plotting to break into his life. To him, the world still felt safe. He believed that hard work and goodness were enough to keep evil away. Inside, Quiana was humming softly as she prepared for bed. unaware that this piece, their dream life together, was living on borrowed time. The night of October 15th, 2008, began like any other for Jan and Quiana Pietrzak. The air was calm, the neighborhood quiet, and their small home glowed softly beneath the porch light. Inside, the couple shared a simple evening together, unaware that they were being watched. Jan had just returned from work, tired but content, while Quiana was finishing up a few chores before they settled in for the night. They had plans for the weekend, small things that only newlyweds dream about, movies, dinners, maybe a drive along the coast. To them, life felt steady, almost perfect. But only miles away, 4 men were plotting to shatter it all. The men who once served alongside John in the Marines had fallen into bitterness after leaving the service. They missed the structure, the authority, and the brotherhood that had once defined their lives. Now they were restless, broke, and angry. They knew John had done well for himself, that he owned a home, and that he was recently married. To them, he represented everything they didn't have. What began as casual talk about robbery soon evolved into a plan. They convinced themselves that John and Quiana had money, expensive belongings, maybe even a safe hidden somewhere. They decided that they would take what they wanted by force. As the night deepened, the group gathered their weapons and covered their faces. They weren't professionals, but they were dangerous because they no longer cared about consequences. Fueled by jealousy and hate, they drove toward Winchester, the quiet suburban community where Jan and Quiana lived. The journey was silent, the only sounds coming from the hum of the engine and their shallow breaths. Somewhere along the way, the idea of a simple robbery began to twist into something darker. It was no longer just about taking possessions. It became about power, domination, and rage. The men arrived near midnight, parking a short distance away to avoid attention. The street was still, lit only by the moon and the faint glow of nearby houses. Jan and Quiana's home stood quietly at the end of the block, a symbol of their new life together. The men moved quickly, forcing their way in. Inside, the couple's sense of safety was ripped away in an instant. The intruders stormed the house with violence, their presence turning the warm, loving home into a scene of terror. What followed was unspeakable cruelty. Jan, once a Marine trained to protect, found himself powerless against the group that outnumbered and overpowered him. The men's anger grew as they taunted and humiliated their victims, feeding off each other's hate. The robbery spiraled far beyond theft. It became personal, hateful, and sadistic. The same men who once saluted the same flag as John now treated him and his wife with unimaginable brutality. They wanted control, and they wanted to destroy what they envied. The attack stretched into the early hours of the morning, leaving behind a trail of chaos and horror. When they were done, the men tried to erase their crime. They took what little they could carry, scattering stolen items into Quiana's car before attempting to set the home ablaze. Smoke began to curl from the corners of the living room, mixing with the scent of gasoline and ash. The flames licked at the walls, devouring photographs, clothes, and furniture, pieces of the life John and Quiana had built together. As the fire spread, the men fled into the darkness, believing they had destroyed all traces of what they had done. But evil always leaves evidence behind. Their fingerprints, footprints, and DNA lingered within the wreckage. They thought the fire would consume everything, but it only illuminated the depth of their cruelty. The home that once echoed with laughter was now silent, its warmth replaced by the choking smell of smoke and loss. The night that began as peaceful and ordinary ended in horror. What had been a symbol of love became a place of unimaginable tragedy. As dawn approached, the neighborhood remained still, unaware of the unspeakable violence that had taken place just a few doors away. The men disappeared into the early morning light, carrying with them the illusion of having escaped justice. But the truth would not stay buried for long. The nightmare they created would soon unravel. piece by piece, until every secret, every act, and every face behind that cruelty was exposed. When morning arrived, the quiet neighborhood of Winchester was disrupted by a faint trail of smoke rising from the Pietrzak's home. A neighbor, on her way to work, noticed the front door slightly open and the smell of something burning. At first she thought it might be a small kitchen fire, but when she called out and no one answered, unease set in. Moments later, firefighters arrived and pushed their way inside. What they found stopped them in their tracks. The scene was beyond anything they could have imagined. The house was filled with smoke, furniture overturned, and the remains of a fire that had been hastily set. Amid the destruction were the lifeless bodies of John and Quiana Pietrzak. Both were bound, gagged, and left in a way that told investigators this was no random act of violence. The first responders stood in stunned silence. Even those accustomed to tragedy felt shaken by what they saw. The violence had been deliberate and cruel, the kind that spoke of anger, not desperation. The fire had burned portions of the living room and hallway, but most of the evidence had survived. It didn't take long for detectives to determine that this was more than a burglary gone wrong. It was personal. The brutality went far beyond what any thief would do. Whoever had done this wanted to send a message. As word spread, the crime scene quickly drew attention from the media and the community. A young newlywed couple murdered in their own home. It was the kind of story that sent shockwaves through the quiet suburb. News cameras lined the streets as investigators worked tirelessly to collect evidence. They photographed every inch of the house, collected fingerprints from surfaces, and bagged anything that seemed out of place. Inside the charred remains, they found small but crucial clues: footprints near the doorway, traces of blood that didn't belong to the victims, and partial fingerprints that matched no one in the household. Detectives began interviewing neighbors, trying to piece together the final hours of John and Quiana's lives. Some recalled hearing faint noises late at night, maybe shouting or movement, but no one could have guessed what was happening inside. The couple had no known enemies, no history of trouble. Friends described them as kind, loving, and grounded. The question everyone asked was the same: who would do this to them? The investigation quickly turned toward the people Jan knew through his work at Camp Pendleton. As a Marine sergeant, Jan had worked with many young men, some of whom had recently been discharged. Detectives learned that a few of them had visited the house before, and some even knew details about Jan's possessions and routines. When one of those names surfaced again and again during interviews, suspicion grew stronger. As forensic teams processed evidence from the scene, they matched one of the fingerprints to a former Marine who had recently been in trouble with the law. That match opened the floodgates. Further investigation revealed that this man wasn't alone. He had been seen with 3 others the night of the murders. One of them had pawned a gold ring that matched a piece of Quiana's jewelry, while another had been driving a car resembling the one caught on a neighbor's security camera. Piece by piece, the puzzle was coming together. But the true horror came when detectives learned that the motive wasn't just greed. In conversations between the suspects, hate-filled remarks surfaced, comments about race, jealousy, and resentment toward Jan's success. What began as a robbery had transformed into something far darker, fueled by prejudice and rage. It wasn't only about what they could steal. It was about destroying what they couldn't stand to see: love, success, and happiness between 2 people they envied. The crime scene, once a home filled with warmth, became the starting point of a case that would expose not only the cruelty of the killers, but also the ugliness that still existed in the shadows of society. For investigators, this wasn't just about solving a murder. It became a mission to bring justice to a couple whose only crime was living in love and peace. By the end of the day, the house was sealed off with yellow tape, the bodies removed with care, and the quiet suburban street turned into a place haunted by loss. But beneath the grief, a promise began to form. Those responsible would be found, and the truth behind this unspeakable act would be brought to light. As the investigation deepened, Detectives began to piece together a web of betrayal and cruelty that defied understanding. The evidence collected from the Pietrzak's home painted a horrifying picture, and every new discovery led them closer to a group of men who once stood beside John in uniform. The Marine's bond was supposed to represent loyalty, courage, and honor, yet the killers had twisted that brotherhood into something vile. Their names soon surfaced in connection to the crime: 4 former Marines who had served at Camp Pendleton. Each of them carried a mixture of resentment and bitterness, the kind that festers when discipline fades and hate takes its place. Detectives traced them through the smallest mistakes. One had pawned Quiana's engagement ring at a local shop. Another had left DNA on a piece of duct tape used to bind the victims, and a third had been caught bragging about a robbery that turned violent. As officers dug deeper, it became clear this was not a random break-in. The men had planned the attack, driven by a mix of greed and racial hatred. Jan's life symbolized everything they had lost: structure, respect, and stability. His interracial marriage ignited something even darker inside them, a toxic combination of jealousy and prejudice that would lead to murder. When the arrests began, the community was stunned. The suspects were young, fit, and seemingly ordinary. Neighbors who had known them could hardly believe what they were hearing, yet behind their calm faces was a shared secret, one rooted in hate. Each man had played a part in the crime. One had led the assault, another had helped restrain the couple, and the others had participated in the torture and destruction. The details that emerged were gruesome, showing a level of brutality far beyond what anyone expected. It was not a robbery gone wrong. It was a hate-fueled execution disguised as theft. The trial that followed captured national attention. Courtrooms filled with reporters, family members, and fellow Marines who came seeking answers. The prosecution presented evidence with chilling precision: photos from the scene, fingerprint analysis, and recorded confessions. For the first time, the public heard about the moments leading up to the murders. The suspects had targeted Jan's home specifically. They believed he had money hidden somewhere, and when they didn't find it, their anger exploded. They taunted the couple, mocked their love, and unleashed violence that spoke to something far deeper than greed. Witnesses testified about overheard comments and racist jokes made by the suspects before the attack. It became clear that John's success, his marriage to Quiana, and his steady moral compass had become unbearable to those who envied him. The prosecution revealed that the men had even planned to make it look like a random home invasion. But their carelessness, using Quiana's car, leaving fingerprints, and selling stolen jewelry, exposed their guilt. Piece by piece, the image of their cruelty became undeniable. As the verdicts were read, the courtroom was filled with silence. The families of John and Quiana sat together, holding on to one another as the judge announced the sentences. Each of the men was found guilty of murder, robbery, and special circumstances that made them eligible for the death penalty. For many, the verdict brought a sense of relief but not peace. No sentence could ever undo what had been taken from them. The lives of 2 innocent people had been destroyed, and all that remained were memories and grief. For Jan's fellow Marines who attended the trial, the betrayal cut especially deep. They couldn't reconcile how men who once wore the same uniform could commit such an atrocity. The Marine Corps, built on honor and brotherhood, now carried the shadow of this crime. For the families, justice had come, but it felt hollow. They had endured the unbearable. To see the faces of the men who destroyed their loved ones, and to hear, in cold detail, how hate had consumed them. In the end, the trial exposed more than a single act of violence. It revealed how easily envy and prejudice can twist the human heart. What had started as resentment over another man's success turned into a crime that shocked the nation. The 4 killers, once brothers in arms, had become enemies of everything they once vowed to protect. And for Jan and Quiana, their love, once full of promise, had become a symbol of what can be lost when hate takes control. Justice was eventually served, but it felt hollow in the face of what had been lost. The verdicts brought a measure of closure, yet no sentence could ever balance the scale of such tragedy. The 4 former Marines were condemned to death, their lives now confined to prison walls where the echoes of their crime would follow them forever. For the families of John and Quiana Pietrzak, those words, guilty and sentenced, did not bring comfort. They brought silence, the kind that comes when grief has nowhere else to go. Their loved ones were gone, their laughter and light extinguished in a single night of senseless brutality. In the months following the trial, the community of Winchester struggled to return to normal. The Pietrzak home, once filled with love, remained vacant for years. Its windows boarded, its walls scarred by fire and memory. Neighbors avoided walking too close to it, their eyes lowering as they passed. It wasn't just a house, it was a reminder of what hatred could do when left to fester. For Jan's fellow Marines, the loss cut deeply. He had represented everything good about the service: discipline, honor, loyalty, and to see his life ended at the hands of those who once stood beside him felt like an unforgivable betrayal. Quiana's family spoke of her often, remembering the way her smile could light up a room, how she believed in kindness even when the world didn't always return it. Her mother couldn't bear to visit the site of the crime. She said it felt like walking through a graveyard that shouldn't exist. Friends organized memorials, planting flowers and lighting candles to honor the couple's memory. Each year on the anniversary of their deaths, people gathered to speak their names, refusing to let them fade into silence. The story of John and Quiana spread far beyond California. News outlets across the country covered the case not just for its brutality, but for what it revealed about the darkness still lurking beneath the surface of society. It wasn't simply a story of robbery or murder. It was about the ugliness of hate and the fragility of love in a world that sometimes refuses to accept it. The couple's interracial marriage had made them targets of resentment from men too weak to confront their own failures. Their killers had seen their happiness and turned it into fuel for cruelty. For many who followed the case, it became a painful reflection of how prejudice still thrives, even among those sworn to protect others. The Marines, as an institution, mourned the loss publicly, honoring Jan's service and condemning the men who betrayed everything the uniform stood for. At military bases across the country, his story was retold in quiet conversations, a tragic reminder that honor means nothing when humanity is lost. Years passed, but the memory of that night never truly faded. Jan and Quiana's families found ways to move forward, carrying their grief like a shadow that never disappeared. They spoke about forgiveness but admitted that some wounds never heal. They wanted people to remember the victims not for how they died, but for how they lived. 2 souls who believed in love, who worked hard, who wanted nothing more than to build a future together. Their love story, once full of promise, became a symbol of resilience and remembrance. Communities began hosting awareness events to address hate crimes, using the Pietrzak's names as a reminder of why such acts can never be ignored. Their tragedy inspired others to speak out, to challenge prejudice wherever it appeared. Though justice had been delivered in a courtroom, the deeper fight, the battle against hate itself, was still far from over. In the end, John and Quiana's story stands as both a warning and a testament. A warning of how easily hatred can destroy, and a testament to the enduring power of love even in death. They were 2 people who had found each other in a world divided by differences, who believed that love could bridge anything. But in one cruel night their dreams were burned away by men consumed by envy and intolerance. Still, their memory lives on, proof that while hate can take lives, it can never erase love.